Brother Elwell, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh,
Good
we're so
to hear
happy
you
to have you. Oh, yeah, it's so great to have you. Yeah, folks emailed us. They were really excited that we were going to bring you back on again. We got a full house. Numbers are very high right now. Praise Jesus. Folks are very, very interested in your research, and you know, I'm sure by now they're also very curious how you perceive, you know, the progress of this. You know, based on your research and the timing of, you know, your analysis of its trajectory, you know, where you think it might be, when you think it might maybe manifest potentially, that kind of stuff. But anyway, I'm just going to go ahead and turn the mic over to you and say, have at it. Praise God.
Okay. Right now, no one knows exactly where Planet X is at. The mainstream scientific community believes it's somewhere south of the ecliptic, that it actually, and its orbital path is actually at an angle to the ecliptic. So it spends most of its orbit actually below the other planets, you know, relative to Earth's North Pole. But when it approaches its perihelion and the asteroid belt, it actually comes up through the plane of the ecliptic and is actually, when it comes closest to the sun, it's actually higher in the sky than the other planets. So it's kind of interesting. It is an interesting orbital path. Right now, most scientists think it's coming somewhere from the south, and the general consensus that I think it's actually coming from the constellation of Taurus. It'll appear in or near the horns of Taurus, or possibly in Orion, or somewhere in between them. It'll probably travel around those constellations as it approaches. It'll probably come through Taurus and then pass over Orion and so forth as it passes through the plane of the ecliptic. Right now, we don't know exactly where it is. We're pretty sure if it is going to be the sign of the Son of Man, the end of the age, that's going to appear suddenly in the heavens as a heavenly sign of Jesus' second coming. Now, exactly what does that mean? It says in Matthew 24:30 that the sign of the Son of Man in the end of the age will precede the second coming of Christ and possibly be even a part of it, because it says in Matthew 24 that there'll be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and the planets themselves, or the powers of the heavens themselves, will be shaken. It says in Matthew 24:29, the powers of the heavens shall be shaken, and the powers of the heavens are literally the planets. So this means literally that the orbits of the planets will be altered in the tribulation of those days, which is near the end of the tribulation. And then right after that, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heavens with, and Jesus will, he says, the sign of the Son of Man, and the Son of Man himself will come in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And so this happens right before the resurrection event described in Matthew 24:31, where he sends his angels with the great sound of a trumpet, and the elect are gathered together from the four winds. So somehow my theory was that the planet itself is somehow related to the resurrection event, and it's also related to the great end time battle that will happen at the end of time, at the end of the tribulation. Some people think that the resurrection or the rapture will occur at the beginning, some at the end. Some people are preaching two raptures. I'm actually what's called a seventh trumpet rapture person. I think actually the appearance of Planet X and the final assault on Earth from heaven and the assault on the forces of Satan will be about the same time. Basically what happens is the believers are resurrected, the heavenly army is formed, and they return back with Jesus to fight against the powers of evil. And Planet X will be an intrinsic part of that. In fact, it's very similar to the kind of the storyline of the original Star Wars movies, in that there's this huge planet-like object coming right towards them, along with a star fleet and the rest of it. The major difference being in the movie Star Wars, the people with the approaching planet and the fleet and all the rest, those are the bad guys, whereas in the end times it appears that those will actually be the good guys. Jesus will be leading this sort of heavenly army. Right behind him, Planet X will be kind of basically being used to wreak havoc on Earth with various asteroids and comets, as described in the trumpet events. Those are basically what sound like asteroids and comets striking the Earth, which will probably be emanating from or being as a result of Planet X's near passing. So a lot of what we're seeing with the tribulation is the description of the sort of events that would happen if a large planet passed by Earth. You would have asteroids and comets, comet-like objects striking Earth, because those are probably going to be in its orbital path. And so it makes sense that you'd have giant, heavenly mountains, what are described as burning mountains, and these great other objects that really sound a lot like comets and asteroids striking Earth, because that's what will happen. And Jesus himself says he is immediately preceded by this sign in heaven. And so what my theory is that the sign in heaven, described in Matthew 24:30, is actually Planet X, which has an orbital period of roughly 2,000 years. And every 2,000 years or so, God has been reappearing and visiting Earth to see how things are coming along. The last time he visited was when Jesus was born, and the Planet X appeared as the Star of Bethlehem. And next time he appears, he'll be returning to conquer and take over the earth as the conquering king rather than as the suffering servant. And the next time it appears, it'll be appear as the sign of the Son of Man at the end of the age, as described in Matthew 24:30. So with Planet X, we basically have this large planet, which a long period orbit like that of a long period comet, which roughly 2,000 years or so. And every time it comes back to Earth, in the vicinity of Earth, and it's close past to the Sun, God will actually come himself in some form down to Earth to visit Earth and see how things are going. 2,000 years before, 4,000 years before, he appeared to Abraham along with his two servants in a visible form. This is when God came to visit Abraham right before he sent his two servants to take out Sodom and Gomorrah. He actually appeared spoke to Abraham and visited with Abraham. It was interesting to note then I think it was the Apocalypse of Abraham or the Testament of Abraham. One of those apocalyptic or apocryphal literatures about Abraham's life. He was actually described as having his birth preceded by a heavenly sign or star as well. And so that was my hint to say, well, this is Planet X having reappeared back then too, roughly 4,000 years ago. Then he appeared around 0 AD as the Star of Bethlehem. And if he reappears in our time, once again, roughly 2,000 years later, the sign of the Son of Man is probably a description of yet another appearance of Planet X. So we have this cyclical pattern of God returning every 2,000 years or so, preceded by this star in heaven. And when major events are about to happen, for example, the birth of Abraham in his life, which was a major event, the birth of Jesus 2,000 years later, Jesus' return an additional 2,000 years later, as a sign of the Son of Man. So its exact position is unknown. I personally think, however, it is approaching. But it won't be visible from Earth until it passes the orbit of Jupiter, because like comets, which are mostly very dark asteroids, which have some water on their surfaces, which gives them their comet tail. Most of these asteroids and the comets are actually covered with this thick tar-like organic goo, which makes them pretty much invisible to optical telescopes until they come close enough to the sun for sublimation to occur and their comet tail to form, at which time, and only at that time, do they become visible by optical telescopes and human eyes. I suspect that Planet X is much similar in the sense that it also has a large preponderance of dust and dark clouds surrounding it, so that it's actually invisible to the naked eye until it comes close to the sun, at which time it actually forms a comet-like tail. In this case, it looks more like a pair of wings, because in the Sumerian images of this planet, it actually appears to be kind of like it has wings instead of a tail, which is probably just the way, because it's such a large object, it probably has a lot more water, and the fluid dynamics of it's a little bit different. But it's essentially an appearance of a gigantic comet, and it won't appear again visible to Earth until it passes Jupiter, at which time the solar winds are powerful enough to start the comet tail to start forming. And that comet tail will then make it visible from Earth suddenly and gloriously, just like Jesus describes. He will reappear like a thief in the night. This is what he's returning. This is what he's talking about. Planet X will suddenly and gloriously become visible within maybe a matter of weeks or even days. as this comet tail suddenly begins to form, people on Earth will begin to see it and realize exactly what's happening, what's been hidden from this entire time, and what's about to happen. And that's what it says in Revelation. I think it's Revelation 6. I'll look it up. Men are hiding themselves under the rocks to hide against the throne of the Lamb, because they can suddenly see this thing in heaven, and it's approaching Earth. And this happens about midway through the tribulation, I believe, actually, right after all the then believing Christians on Earth are Christianity, organized Christianity, is destroyed, and most Christians are executed. Because of this, they then see that God's vengeance is coming in heaven, and they're about to get really wild because Planet X is about to attack within the next couple of years. And so then it'll appear at its closest point to the sun, probably about 6 or 7 years into the tribulation, at which time it'll come close enough to Earth to actually cause significant disasters. And that's when you have not only the trumpet judgments, but also the bowl judgments, which are the most powerful effects of Planet X as it passes closest to Earth. And then right after Planet X does its damage, then Jesus' heavenly army will attack and wipe out everything that's left over, which won't be much, because Planet X's attack will be pretty dramatic, and pretty destructive, as it's described in the Book of Revelation. We see these bowl judgments where all life in the seas is destroyed, and all the green grass and all the trees are destroyed. I mean, there's not much left, and the major cities are being destroyed. All that's going to be left is basically these underground bunkers, and a lot of them are going to be taken out. The reference to Planet X actually appearing in the heavens, I think the first time mankind actually sees it. And it says that in Revelation 6. Where the kings of the earth and the great man and the rich men and the chief captains and the mighty men and every bondman and every free man hid themselves in the dens on the rock of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? I think they're actually seeing Planet X beginning to appear, and this actually happens right after the sixth seal. Basically, what sounds like a massive meteor shower. It says in Revelation 6:13, and the stars of heaven fell into the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. What this means is that the meteor shower, like the long day of Joshua, there were so many heavy meteors hitting Earth, probably at an angle contrary to its rotation rate, that Earth's rotation is actually altered, probably because the crust is temporarily displaced from the mantle, and it becomes, independent of the mantle temporarily, slowing down or possibly reversing. And in this way, as from our current reckoning, every mountain and island is actually moved from its place, because the entire crust is being displaced above the mantle by these massive, huge asteroids that are hitting the Earth, causing massive destruction to Earth's cities. These are much more powerful than nuclear weapons. Even though they're not radioactive, they're sending out gigantic clouds of dust into the atmosphere, which will result in a nuclear winter. And for years to come, the summer's going to be colder and shorter, and the winters are going to be long and very cold. So God is basically breaking down the civilization that mankind had built in opposition to him by battering with asteroid after asteroid after asteroid, to the point where when he actually does return at the head of his heavenly army, comprised of the believers who were resurrected, then he'll be more of a mop-up action rather than an actual battle, and they'll be focusing on taking out the last strong military force, which will apparently be assembling itself in the Vale of Megiddo, in I think it's south of Palestine area. But yeah, that's kind of the general idea behind the Planet X theory, is that it's a planet that's been hidden from mankind on purpose, but has been one of God's primary secrets. In fact, in my opinion, it is actually the great secret of the Book of Revelation. When I was writing the book, I've been studying Annihilation and some other parallel texts that were similar to but not the same as the biblical text regarding the resurrection, or regarding the creation, I mean. And a number of theologians had noted similarities between the Babylonian creation epic and also biblical texts. Some had theorized that the Bible had simply been ripped off from them, but others think that they were just parallel traditions drawing on the same root source material, which is my... And I noted that the description of the Babylonian god Marduk, which is Planet X in the Sitchinite theory, very similar. When I was reading Revelation 4, I recognized the description of Jesus on his throne was similar in kind of scope and concept to that of the description of Marduk on his throne, almost to the point where it seemed that Jesus was actually saying, Marduk is a false god, I am the one true God, and I am the king of this heavenly throne. And I realized, what if he was actually talking about Planet X, because it seemed to be kind of the idea behind the end times. If Planet X did exist, it would be a huge deal, and it would be a great secret, a very great secret that had been hidden very, very carefully from mankind for a long time. And if it did exist and it came close to Earth, it would have massive destructive effects. What if it was actually not just a part of the book of Revelation, but was actually the central secret of the book of Revelation, which will be revealed in the end times? And so I looked at Revelation 4, I realized, this is a description not of some big square throne that, the God is sitting in heaven, that Jesus is sitting on. This is actually a description of Planet X itself. The heavenly throne is symbolically his Planet X is symbolically his heavenly throne. I thought about that, and I was looking at the description of the throne, and he says it was like a jasper and a sardine stone. This is Revelation 4:3, and there was a rainbow around it, like an emerald. I realized, he's basically saying sardine stone is basically a red stone, and he's saying this throne in heaven was a stone in heaven, literally a stone in heaven that was red. And I'm just taking this earlier. This thing is saying that there was a red stone in heaven with a rainbow around it, which I think might actually be a description of what a Saturn-like ring system, and which Planet X would probably have too, because if there was a lot of shadow material in orbit around it, it would form a ring. So that would make sense. And it also says around the throne were 24 and 20 seats, and 24 seats, 24 elders, and 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, and also 4 beasts around it. I remembered in the description of the appearance of Marduk and Elish that he was surrounded by 2 sets of winds, what he was called, like these objects that he used as weapons. And I remember in Hebrew, the word for spirit, ruach, actually basically means wind. So the concept of these spirits around the throne could be translated as winds around the throne too. And I thought of that, maybe there is since there's a group of 4 winds around Marduk's throne and a group of 7 winds also, 2 separate groups. And there's also two separate groups of spirits or winds around the throne of Jesus, a group of 4 creatures, as they're called, and a group of 7 flaming lamps. Maybe they're actually talking about satellites surrounding Planet X. Moreover, in another show, I was asked, why do the 4 creatures, why are they described as being full of eyes before and behind? In Revelation 4:6, it says they're basically covered with eyes. And it basically, the Hebrew word for eye is ayin, which basically means nothing. It's like saying not or ought. And the application of the word ayin means when you're referring to a person, ayin refers to the eye socket or the eye in general. And when referring to a planet or an object of any kind, it's like it has a hole in it. And so if you're talking about these 4 objects around the throne of God, if this was indeed a planetary concept, and these were actually satellites, it would make sense, because in that context it would not be translated as eyes, it would be translated as craters. Just like our moon is covered with craters, so too these moons around Planet X are covered with craters, so that makes sense. And so that's kind of where I'm at now. Basically, what we have is a situation where Planet X is going to be returning. We're going to see this thing again. It's going to be the most incredible sight. And like you guys were talking about before, this whole buildup and all these terrorist actions were being herded towards a one world unified system, which could be used to oppose the second coming of Christ and all of his forces. So it'll be basically not only the forces of Jesus and the force versus the force of Satan, it'll also be one planet versus another planet. Planet X versus Earth, Jesus versus Satan. It's Jesus' throne versus Satan's throne. You see how that works. And so it makes sense at this point, in this context, that this would actually not just be a heavenly sign like a star or a supernova armies. And so that's kind of where I'm at now. And but there hasn't been any additional Planet X information coming out recently. Most of the Planet X information of significance came out in the 80s and 90s because of the Voyager probes, and when they flew past the outer planets, they realized there must be kind of a Planet X object out there, because that's the only way that we can explain these anomalies in the outer planets that the Voyager probes found. But since that time, we haven't had any significant stuff because we haven't had any probes out there that have found anything. So right now, all we do is speculate.
Right. What I think is two things. Well, one thing in particular. First of all, Lowell, according to the encyclopedias, and I'll quote this to you. I don't know what the citation. Actually, there are several citations to this paragraph. It says Percival Lowell's greatest contribution to planetary studies came during the last decade of his life, which he devoted to the search for Planet X, a hypothetical planet beyond Neptune. Lowell believed that the planets Uranus and Neptune were displaced from their predicted positions by the gravity of the unseen planet. Lowell started his search program in 1906 using a camera of 5 inches in aperture. The small field of view, 42-inch, 110-centimeter reflecting telescope rendered the instruments impractical for searching. From 1914 to 1916, a 9-inch, 23-centimeter telescope was on loan from the Sproul Observatory, which was used to search for Planet X. Although Lowell did not discover Pluto, Lowell's observatory did photograph Pluto in March and April of 1915. And it goes on to explain that the reason why Lowell ultimately even heard about or even speculated that Planet X existed originally was because of his study of gods, little g gods, of Japan. And the Far East and such. And I noticed in your book, you had tied in some of the ancient Near Eastern religion planetary deities, and I wondered if maybe that was some of the stuff that triggered Lowell into thinking, hey, this might be the real deal, and kind of thrust his research forward. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, the astronomers had always been motivated by the search for extraterrestrial life and try to understand our history too. And I do think that part of the motivation was to see, since there were 12 gods, maybe there were 12 objects in our solar system to account for the gods, because in every tradition since the Sumerians, and probably before that, consistently every major empire passed down from one to the other the belief that all the planets were gods, or the thrones of gods, to be more specifically, and they were to be worshipped as gods. And so from Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, and all the way to Rome, where we have our current planet names, Mars, Jupiter, Venus, these are all Roman deity names. They felt that they wanted to justify, prove or deny, was the fact that these named after gods did have any significance. Was there, in fact, deity is associated with these planets, and were there enough planets to be, account for all these gods? And the pantheon of 12, it was always 12. Even since the Sumerians, 12 was the magic number. The Romans even followed this pattern. If you're missing a god, another one was put in his place to make sure he always had 12. And so Zechariah Sitchin picked up on this fact. He had his own twist on it, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I do believe his theory that the Sumerians were actually talking about literal planets moving through our solar system and causing chaos. I do believe he was correct, not because I wanted to, because it lines up with the facts. Now, this is not some Velikovsky garbage, and Velikovsky was terrible. I can't even read him. Even when I was a kid, I read Velikovsky and I realized, this is garbage. It didn't make any sense. how can Venus emerge out of Jupiter and be in its current orbit? It would have a hugely elliptical orbit if it had come outside of Jupiter. It has to have formed in its original orbital path in order to have such a perfectly circular orbit, which is another point I make in the book. Or at least maybe, I don't know if I made it in the book, if I've made it since then. Why do the orbital characteristics of Mercury and Venus, why are they perfectly the way they should be according to normal nebular hypothesis, where planets form out of the nebular disk and they're either prograde or retrograde orbits, that is to say backwards, they rotate either backwards and forwards. Their orbits will be stable and circular. They wouldn't have any significant moons or circular satellite systems, no axial tilts, no large impacts, no oceans. They'd be very boring, basically, and they'd be basically the same way they were when they formed, according to the nebular hypothesis, when they formed out of the nebular disk. They're basically the same as they would have done according to the scientific models, which show that Mercury and Venus are pretty much the way they should be. But when you go to Earth on outwards, every single planet is an oddball. It doesn't match up with the standard accretional hypothesis. It shouldn't be this way. Earth should not have this 23.5 degree axial tilt. It should not have such a gigantic moon. It's the only planet in the solar system that has an ocean, which must have been caused by one or more giant impactors, because the Earth's ocean is believed was actually formed out of impact events which forced water out of the mantle, because most of the mantle is actually comprised, most of the water on Earth is actually in the mantle, in water-bearing what are called hydrous minerals, like serpentine and talc, which are partly made of water. And when they're subjected to compression by a violent force, such as an asteroid impact, they release the water chemically. The chemical bonds are broken and the water is released. So my theory is that the same impactor that created the moon also created the oceans, and thereby the atmosphere as we have today, because otherwise we would have enough, carbon dioxide and water and related elements to support life, to have the kind of atmosphere we have, the hydrosphere we have with all the water and the rain and so forth, and the clouds. All these events were created by one gigantic impact, and they could only have been created by one gigantic impact. Earth's axial tilt, its rapid rotation rate, once every 24 hours. Venus rotates maybe 3 to 5 times as much, 3 to 4 times per year on its axis. We rotate 365 times per year. Why are we so much faster than Venus or Mercury is also very slow? But Earth on outwards, they're very rapid rotations, as if energy had been added to the rotation by some external object, adding energy into the system. So the only way, in my opinion, to explain these anomalies is to say there has to be an external force coming in, adding energy into the planets, which manifests itself in the form of causing them to spin faster, causing them to have axial tilts, whereas they should not have had axial tilts. As they formed out of the nebular cloud, they should be perfectly perpendicular to the nebular, the line of the ecliptic. They're not. None of them are. Even Jupiter has a slight angle to its axial tilt. There shouldn't be any significant moons. There's no reason to have any, unless there's an actor coming outside the system to penetrate it and cause the creation of a moon, because Earth's moon it's now universally agreed, was created by a giant impactor striking Earth at a rapid rate, an impactor which was roughly the size of Mars, not Mars itself, but about that size and mass, striking Earth, jettisoning out a large amount of its mantle, which cooled and solidified into orbit around the Earth to form the moon. That has been proven mathematically and chemically that it has to have happened that way. So how do these other moons form? Dozens of moons on all these other planets. How are they forming? There must have been an actor coming in our solar system, disrupting them, dropping off moons as it passes through. And by Jupiter and Saturn have dozens of moons. They shouldn't have formed that way. It doesn't make any sense. The ring systems, why are they there? Why does I guess Uranus have a ring system, which apparently formed after it was tilted on its side. Totally bizarre. There's so many would pass close enough to them at a rapid rate to cause, gravitational interactions, which would cause them to, for example, the planet Neptune to be tilted at a significant angle. Planet Uranus is tilted so dramatically that its south polar axis is currently almost pointed directly at the sun, and that's an extreme difference from what it should be. It's like 70-something, 65, 70% off where it should be if it were perpendicular to the angle of the ecliptic. It's way, way off. And so basically right now, the North Pole on the North rotational pole on Uranus is in total darkness and will be for hundreds of years. But its South Pole is receiving direct sunlight, or near to it, and it'll have direct sunlight for centuries more. It doesn't make any sense. It could only have happened if a massive object passed into our solar system from the outside at an angle, at an approach which is more or less perpendicular to the orbits of the planets, and interacted with them occasionally, once every few thousand years, imparted some of its energy into the systems and caused these axial tilts. It causes these moons to form through, catastrophic collisions. And this is not me talking. This is actual scientists who studied the Voyager data. This is the conclusion they came to. It isn't wacko conspiracy theories on the internet or Zechariah Sitchin or whoever. This is the best people in the world, best astronomers, best physicists, best people ever, top men. They said Planet X must have caused this, not me, not Sitchin, not anybody else. And that's why I'm so confident in this hypothesis, because it's backed up by real scientific data. The scientists are saying this. And they've been propagating this knowledge for decades. Just nobody is listening. It requires people you have to keep pushing. You have to say, coming back at it again and again and again. Planet X is out there. Planet X is out there. Planet X is out there. It has to be out there. The science proves it. Why don't you accept it? Why would you not accept it? That's what bothers me. Is people, they don't think about science. They don't care about facts. They're like, what do I want? What do I don't want? And they base their decision making based on their own personal opinions and what they want to see, rather than what the facts state. You can leave the Bible out of it. You can leave Sitchin out of it. Just boil it down to the facts. Planet X has to exist, and it has to fit the criteria that Sitchin suggested, that it's going to enter into our solar system occasionally and become visible. The historical data backs this up. Abraham was preceded by a star that came out of nowhere. The Magi followed a star that came out of nowhere. The second coming of Christ, another star comes out of nowhere. Roughly 2,000 year gap between each of those. Why is it so hard to understand? I don't get it. Very easy to understand, very simple, backed by facts. Everyone agrees with it. All the traditions agree with it. The science is there. The religion is there. All you have to do is be open-minded enough to accept it, and that is the toughest thing to do, because if you have all the facts, if people don't want to accept it, they will not accept it, and there's nothing you can do to change that.
Yeah, amen. I mean, I did some research on, yellow dwarf stars in the Milky Way galaxy, and supposedly, I wish I had the article handy here right at this moment. I don't have another one though, but evidently, it's well known by astrophysicists that yellow dwarf stars, which is what we have in the Milky Way galaxy, the predominant or the vast majority of them are binary. That it's extremely common for yellow dwarf stars in this galaxy to be binary star systems. So, just de facto, default common sense would indicate that we probably would be binary as the other ones, or the majority of the other ones are. Here's another thing that's interesting, I think. April 25th of 2011. Published on Cornell University site is a paper by Lorenzo Lorio, who's an Italian physicist, I guess, and it says, and the title of the paper is "On the Anomalous Secular Increase of the Eccentricity of the Orbit of the Moon." What's fascinating is there was a movie, because I personally believe, and I know that it's anecdotal in a sense, but when you understand this, when you're a big believer in spirituality, you understand the concepts of lesser magic, you understand how the devil works, and how things work, over the years, and actually going back thousands of years, it makes sense. But anyway, in this paper, he wrote this scientific paper. He basically goes in and it's all very scientifically, written, and says, I'll give a little snippet here. It says basically, a recent analysis of the lunar laser ranging LLR data spanning 38.7 years revealed an anomalous increase to the eccentricity of E of the lunar orbit, amounting to E means equals 9 plus or minus 3 times 10 to the minus 12 over the year cycle. The present day models of dissipative phenomena occurring in the interiors of both the Earth and the Moon are not able to explain it. And then he goes down, I'm going to skip ahead, he says, a potential viable Newtonian candidate would be a trans-Plutonian massive object such as Planet X, Nemesis, Tyche. He actually quotes those in his paper. This paper was vetted by the scientific community and published in the library at Cornell University, and to the best of my understanding, is still there even today. This goes all the way back to April of 2011, which is fascinating. And then another thing I'd like to get you to comment on, because I just think this is so cool, and I know that it's very popular to debunk things. I get that. I get that people who are science-minded, I guess they have a feeling or whatever that if they debunk things that, maybe that adds credibility to their story. I don't know. I've seen it happen time and time again. But, I've been studying this stuff for a long time. And I think it's fascinating that in the movie Deep Impact, which, of course, by the way, coincidentally has a black president, which has been brought up 1,000 times. In that movie, you've got this concept of a meteor ultimately heading toward the Earth. Okay, so most everybody gets that whole premise. Now, what's fascinating, however, other than the correlation of the events and the similarities between that presidency and the things that are going on in the Earth today, there's one thing in that movie that just absolutely knocked me off my chair. When I watched it, I was like, no way. There's a scene, actually multiple scenes, in the movie Deep Impact where at this point this comet, quote, is getting close enough to the Earth where it's an imminent threat. Okay, and they panned the camera back and they put as the little I don't know what you're going to subheading underneath the image. They have the White House. The sun is shining above the White House, and off to the left in the sky, to the left of the sun, is what appears to be a second sun. But in fact, it's the comet that has gotten to the point where, it is reflecting somehow the light of the sun in such a way that during even a daylight hour, in this movie, you're seeing the sun, and then off to the left, what appears to be a second sun. And in the movie, though, it's actually supposed to be the comet. And it would say 2 weeks until impact, 3 weeks until impact, 1 week until impact. And there's this second sun dynamic, a sun and a second sun. And if you go out onto